Hello, my name is Howard Blumenthal, and we are doing yet another episode of Reinventing School. And today is one of our unusual single guest episodes. Part of the reason for that is a hurricane in New Orleans, but now it's my absolute pleasure to spend an entire hour with Deborah MEIER, a name you may well know because, Deborah, I think you've been working in schools, even started to show both of our age. I think I was probably still an elementary student maybe when you started. So I have enormous respect for the fact that you've done as long as you have.
Hello.
Yeah.
I started substitute teaching in Chicago in about 1962. What were you doing in 1962?
I was in elementary school in New York City in public schools and got myself, I think, a really good education in a public school neighborhood in Queens. A little bit mixed, but sort of some Jewish and some German, and a little bit from Jamaica, a little bit from Brooklyn. It was, always a mix because it's New York City. But I'm still in touch with many of the people who were in those classrooms. We were in, at that point, the IGC program, which was we used to, I'm going crazy, but I have a feeling there was a more official name than that. I think it was intellectual
program or something like that.
Yeah.
It was
and then later an SP program. So I was very much of that generation where we were being experimented on, right? They were trying to figure out what you do with post-war babies and how you educate.
Trying to figure out how to keep the middle class and upper middle class in public education. And it turned out that gifted classes, which were, I came to New York City in 1965 with my 3 children, 66 maybe. And I enrolled them in the local public school. And without asking any questions, they all got into the gifted classes. Guess why?
Well, I'm guessing it had more to do with ethnicity and zip code than anything else. We didn't have zip code then, right?
They didn't ask how good they were at anything. They just put them. It was a predominantly Black and some Latino school.
Which borough?
Manhattan, PS9.
Okay.
So I spent the next few years fighting against tracking. And we started a program, in fact, in their middle school, IS 44, to mix kids. We had a nice principal for a while, and he worked with some of the parents, and we created what we called a pilot program with 4 teachers who didn't believe in tracking either. And anyway, it was very exciting.
Well, but this is a very good place to begin the conversation, because for me, it's hard for me to understand what classroom education was like before I was in it. I guess that's probably true of anybody, right? So what I read about, what I've asked my father about, a kid in Brooklyn and Williamsburg, poor neighborhood then, and a guy that got lucky because a teacher said, you don't belong in this public school, you belong in that school, right? So every once in a while, a teacher and a student will match up, and that'll happen. But most of the time it doesn't, I would guess. So
you might, if the teacher knew how to do it, have gotten a splendid education in the non-special class.
Yeah.
That's sort of what I was trying to prove.
And were you right? Because now
yes.
A little bit of distance.
Yes, no, I was right. I was shocked when I started subbing. Now I subbed in Chicago's South Side, K through 8 schools. And I didn't understand how neither teachers or kids would come back every day. It was control was the only issue in the schools. It was like we were waiting for the prisoners to revolt. And that was true of every single school that I subbed in, no matter what grade it was. And the question was to survive, the teacher to survive the day and the kids to survive the day.
And you're talking about early 1960s, yes?
Right.
So 2 very big questions that probably will become the meat of the conversation. The first is why? And the second is same thing now, better, worse? Why originally?
Oh, no worse. It was always that way in American education. Go on, read Laura Ingalls Wilder about the one-room schoolhouses and teachers who had to use corporal punishment and kids standing in the corner. I mean, discipline. Oh, what was that? Well, there was one movie made about a mostly black school.
Yeah.
Anyway, the fact of the matter is, when I was born, which was a long time ago, granted, most kids did not enter high school. So the kids we're talking about didn't have an education. The black kids had none or were in terrible schools. So the kids that I was teaching, their comparable kids 50 years early weren't in schools. And in fact, 20 years earlier, they weren't in schools and they didn't go to high school, much less college. And they had teachers who may have been very nice, but very inexperienced teachers, and teachers changed rapidly. That's just been the class nature of American education, and add race to it. It's not that different if you read English novels about, probably true if you read French novels too, but I don't read them as much. You know, the idea of education was for the ruling class, and everybody else needed to learn to read and write at some point, they thought. And the ruling class needed something else. And those were the kids that got a good education. And that was, to some extent, think about this. The rich people in New York City send themselves kids to schools that charge tuition of $50,000 a year. We spend in public education maybe 12, 13, 14. I'm not sure what it is today. We saw education as a totally different place. Going through a day and I went to a private school, so I didn't know what public schools were like. I thought naturally that you kept company with with teachers, that they were friendly people, that you had music every day and theater and drama and sports and conversation in classes, and mostly were organized seminar-like, that they wanted to hear our voices. I was totally unprepared for my first day subbing.
So
let me get a lot better because the kids were accustomed to being treated as though they were dumb.
But
I went to teacher education. We just finished this one thought. I went to teacher education in Chicago Teachers College, and they told us all that the children we were likely to teach had no language, that they didn't know anything, that they didn't know what books were, and they didn't know what life was. Now, I knew that wasn't true because I lived in the middle of a racially mixed neighborhood in the South Side, near where Obama lived. And I knew they were full of language, and their parents were very devoted to them. But I didn't make any headway in those courses I took in convincing anybody that they were wrong about those kids.
There's this very solid collection of beliefs, right, at the time when you're starting, and those beliefs, although they've evolved, are still in place, but the problems and the solutions just haven't made the kind of progress that we've made on so many other fronts, whether it's health or it's modernization or it's eradication of poverty, of extreme poverty. There are so many areas that we've gotten better at, and yet what I hear over and over again in this format, because we've talked to a lot of people, students and adults, is that there really is almost a lack of desire to improve it. It's almost as if we've made the decision not to make it better for, let's call it, half of the United States. And let me just finish this thought. And then I look at the demographics of voting, because today happens to be one of those days. People will see the recordings later when we'll try to figure out who the next president is going to be. And I'm very curious whether the better educated people go this way, or did we design something here is really, and are we just perpetuating the design, or is there an appetite for change? Black Lives Matter, pick whatever social movement you want. I'm not sensing that we're making the kind of progress that maybe you and I want to see, but maybe there's a reason why not. So what's your perspective?
Well, I think you combine two things. That is hundreds of years of belief that poor people were a different species. You know, when I mention English novels, go back and read them. Whether they were benign or not benign towards the poor, the assumption was really that the poor were just something different than us, so to speak. And if you add race to that, it's very much part of our belief system that we don't even bring it out to look at. And, you know, to believe that Black children, low-income Black children didn't have language, where could you have been? They invented rap music. I mean, where could you be that you could believe something? It's because it's, you know, abstract. They don't understand abstractions. They're just born different. And when I point out to people how much Black or white children know by the time they're 2 years old, before anybody teaches them, just by being a human being with a thirst, as all human beings are, from the moment they get out of their mother's womb, they want to make sense of the world. And literally, and they figure it out. They are scientists and theoreticians from the moment they're born. But in schools, we treat them as though they are another species from us. So now we have a lot of evidence that it doesn't have to be that way. The schools I started, almost all the kids went to college. Most of them did fine in college. Most of them finished college. And they were from East Harlem, and which was the lowest scoring district. Their scores were not ever spectacular. They did somewhat better because it turns out the reading tests are not testing reading, they're testing the social economic status of your parents. Literally, I mean, it's hard to believe, but we've invented a kind of way of measuring kids that is requires us to be prejudiced. If more Black kids get an item right than white kids, that item is thrown out because we know that white kids do better. And they have to be rank orders. So there's always going to be 50% at the bottom 50%. And who's it likely to be?
But
especially that's the same way IQ tests were developed.
It's 2020 now, and we're in a United States that has
50% of the people voted for Trump too.
Okay, there we are. So is there a relationship between those two ideas? Is the idea, you brought it up, of having red states and a president who, let's say, is not progressive? We can describe him as you wish. Is there a relationship between that and the way we manage our schools and the way we treat our students, or are they separate and just happen to be happening at the same time?
We live in different worlds, and on the whole, blue people and red people live in largely different worlds, and Black people and white people do. So for democracy to flourish, there has to be a rough level of equality between people where they imagine other people are much like themselves and whose circumstances give them roughly equal power. And you know, if you're white and you know, the more you know about how terribly we've treated people of color, it seems to me the more you are frightened of them. Suppose they had power. What would they do to us? And I just think that I've always been hoping that I could prove that, you know, as though that would make a difference, that Black and white children, rich and poor children could go to school together with that, and they would all do better because they were in each other's company. and that they were in the company of adults who saw themselves as part of their world. Our attitude towards parents, even white teachers whom are my close friends, we struggled over the question of how we saw their parents, the children's parents. It was easier to begin to think that the children were okay, but the notion that it's the family's fault, the parents are no good, the parents don't love their children. What is it like to be educated by someone, and what's it like to be the parent of someone, a child who's in a school where the adults don't respect you as the adult? And we keep secrets from parents. We say to kids, "I'll tell your parent when you're bad," on the assumption that that's a terrible thing to tell their parents. Right? I mean, that it's meant to frighten them. You're going to tell your parents. Why not parents and teachers talking all the time? Why isn't that a relationship? And I still have relationships with many of the parents who went to our schools. And we talked to each other on the phone, laughed about things together. We treated each other in a different way. We insisted that kids be at family conferences so we wouldn't be telling each other secrets. And the parent goes home and says, the teacher said this, and the kid said that's not true. And then the parent has to decide who's lying to me, the teacher or the child. They're bizarrely organized, our schools. And they are the most authoritarian institution in this country. They're more authoritarian than the Army. And that's for teaching people to become Democrats. We have created an institution, and the poorer you are, the more undemocratic the school is.
So where do we go from here? Okay, I understand what you're describing. We both understand why this is the reality. We don't want it to be the reality. And you've spent a fair number of years trying to make it not the reality. So instead of getting too involved in the details, what do you want it to be? And just sort of, you are opening a new school. It's 2020. How does it work?
Well, first of all, the school should be a democracy. There are many ways we can define that, and the school and the community would have an opportunity to think, what would it mean to have a democratic school? In my opinion, it doesn't mean that children have an equal voice, but there are people who believe they should. And in my belief, at Mission Hill School in Boston, which still is a marvelous school, K through 8, we had a council that made the important decision, and it consisted of 5 elected parents, 5 elected staff members, 5 community people that the 2 groups chose to want to join, and 5 students. We didn't start off with 5 students, but when our students got to a certain age, 5 students that were elected in 6th grade and stayed on the council for 3 years. And it had an enormous impact on the way we talked to each other, saw each other. We had the staff, we had arguments and discussions about what decisions should be left to the faculty and the staff, and which to the parents. Where do our interests possibly clash, and how do we handle that? We had discussions about all the things that is, so to speak, we avoid thinking about in our larger democracy. So we had a rule in the staff that there had to be a consensus, but a consensus didn't mean we all had to like the idea. It was called a rule of the fist or something. And at first thought it was ridiculous. Why do we need rules about how we vote? Why don't we just vote and the majority wins? Well, it turned out it made a big difference to have to convince people who are going to carry out these decisions that they could live with it. It changed the way we saw each other in the faculty.
So at some point, you have to face the question about what will the kids actually learn, right? So there is this prescription, a curriculum of sorts that is shared widely. Is that what we should be organizing your school of
right or wrong with the curriculum we do, except for the fact that teachers have so little input in it and families have so little. So we started off with something we called habits of mind. They were what we claimed were the habits of mind. We took the phrase from John Dewey, that are the habits of a democratic citizen. The first one had to do with evidence. How do you know what you know? What are the cause and effect? What's connections between things? Why does it matter? Etc. So we had those five. We said they should be the basis of our curriculum in all subject matter, and the basis of the way we treat each other, and the basis of how we make judgments about each other. And we stuck with five because I have a very poor rote memory. Six would have probably, I maybe could have handled six. But we'd ask ourselves in faculty meetings, wait a minute, what's the evidence for that? Where did you get that idea? How come you're so sure of it and you're not? I once went to a group of kids, and I think they were about 8th or 9th grade, and we were talking about racism. They were all Black or brown. And I said something about that on prime time, you won't have an outright racist program on at prime time. Maybe, and they all looked puzzled and said, "What? That's ridiculous, Debbie. Do you watch television?" I said, "Not a lot." And they said, "Well, what about Archie Bunker? That's on at prime time and it's very popular, I'm told." And I said, "That's not a racist." Well, there wasn't a kid in that audience who didn't think that. Now, what does it mean to live in the same world that we don't know that? So that we thought, and I think the people who wrote the show thought it was an anti-racist show, right? You remember?
Show both sides of it. So let me focus on, if you were to design a curriculum today, how would the kids spend their time? Would they do math and science and language arts, or would they do your body,
Mission Hill,
something else?
Yeah, at Mission Hill, we had classes that consisted of 2 age groups.
I don't want to know about Mission Hill for this. I want to know what you would do today.
And we changed. I mean, we did it different ways in different schools because, the design of a society also has to be in the context of what the people who are building it together want.
Okay.
So that it wasn't the same is partly because I learned things between the various schools I started, and partly because I was dealing with different people with a different history. And so it's a complication. We had a theme, a fall theme, a winter theme, and a spring theme. One of it was mostly had to do with social studies. One of them had to do with ancient civilizations, and one had to do with science. And we had some essential questions that were at the heart of those studies. And we did that from the K through 8th graders. And they were in classes with 2 age groups, so there were always people to help each other. And we went through a four-year cycle. Over 4 years, kids got exposed to 4 different curriculums that were partly things we had discussed together as a staff that we wanted to make sure we dealt with, like what is justice and is it the same as fairness, and equality versus equity. So, and some of it, was just because something happened in the world. And we had the power to stop for a moment and look at it.
How did you get that power? Isn't the state requirement?
And this is what's amazing. In Boston, the superintendent at the time decided to create something called pilot schools, and they invited me to come up and start one. There was now about 35 of them. His idea originally was that we would learn from them and it would spread. And we had almost complete freedom. The same was true of Central Park East and East Harlem. Tony Alvarado, who was the superintendent, said, "Do whatever you want. I can't give you more money. The only thing I can give you is more freedom. And you're accountable in the sense that people will visit, parents will visit, and if nobody wants to go to your school. So it was so successful. East Harlem parents wanted to get their kids in our school so much that we had to start a Central Park East 2 and a Central Park East 3, and we could have had a 4, except we decided instead to start a secondary school. I think then the Annenberg offered us $50 million for over 5 years to do it on a city, not a citywide, to do it with 50,000 students who represented more or less the population, same mixture population of New York City. And NYU and Columbia agreed to, one to do a statistical study and the other an ethnographic study. And at the end of 5 years, we'd see what we had learned. We'd have about 100, 150 schools.
Let me stop you for a second. When was this?
This was right before I went to Boston. It was 1990 something.
Okay, so 20 years, 30 years ago. And what did you learn?
Well, I learned that it's easy to destroy something. It's hard to build it, but it's easy to destroy it. Now, some of those schools have stayed on. If I had stayed as principal, probably they wouldn't have been able to destroy the school because they respected me, or I don't know why. I had some political allies. I knew Al Shanker, and, for whatever reasons, and I got to MacArthur at the right moment. But they turned down this Annenberg thing. The city of New York turned it down. We had the support of the chancellor, everybody, including the governor and the school and the union. And then we got a new chancellor. Shall I tell you his name?
It doesn't matter. And let me stop you again. I have heard this story, different characters, different schools, different funders, over and over and over again. And none of it seems to stick. So let's pull back.
The private schools manage, the school I went to, which was started in the 19th century as a progressive Deweyan school, is still just that school.
Why?
Because they have the right to be who they are.
But you had the right to be who you were.
Pardon me?
You had the right to be who you were, but it crashed.
Because
stop it from crashing.
We never had it legally the right to be who we were. We had it because somebody gave it to us. Tony Alvarado in New York, and to some degree the chancellor.
But isn't it the right of parents, students, and communities to have a school?
Democratic. I mean, no one, teachers and principals too, do not have what you think of as democratic rights over making decisions about their workplace.
Who does?
Their expertise.
Who does that right?
Well, it depends how the cities are organized. Now in most cities, it's the mayor.
And is it made at the local mayoral level, or is it a governor thing, or is it a federal government thing?
All of an impact, all that have an impact. When the federal government says we won't give you any money if you don't take certain tests, that obviously has an impact. And if you have a chancellor who you think wants to get rid of you because you're a troublemaker, that has an influence. I mean, all kinds of people can make decisions that stop you. And there are no decisions they can make, in my opinion, that really can help you. That's not where the help has to be. It has to be with the people who are interacting with kids and parents and each other. Agreed. And they have to be in a position to decide the important things. Every
country can't have screwed this up as badly as we have, right? There's 200 countries in the world. Yeah, I understand the United States because of the states and the cities and the federal and the way the money flows.
You would think that all those different people, they would have decided we might as well leave it up to the school.
But they haven't. So if I were to travel throughout Europe or throughout South America has 13 countries. they should be different enough from one another that somebody hopefully is getting it right.
Well, there may be more than one way of getting it right, too, depending on.
Okay, but I don't hear the same stories, is what I mean to say. Do you feel as though there are examples of not one school, but very large areas in other parts of the world where it's working?
Well, from what I read, Finland, it's a small country, though, and it has very little poverty. So people will object to the data on the grounds that America partly doesn't look good because we have more poverty than many countries do. If you take out,
All right. Is there a poor country that this works?
I don't know how to know, because the only data we get on schools is their test scores.
Okay. Now,
And they all have a rank order, so there's exactly as many kids in the bottom half as the top half. There are some international tests that where we all take the same test that's not normed by country, which the United States usually does pretty poorly on. But China does well.
why?
But I don't know whether it's cheating. I mean, why should I believe their data? There's so many odd things about it. I think tests are enormously corrupted. There are so many uses and stakes involved that it's a miracle that anyone doesn't cheat.
So, do you want to eliminate tests? Do we need tests?
We need some other form of assessment than
Why?
because they're not judging the right thing on those kinds of tests, and because they're very easy to cheat on, and because those are not the skills we want from people.
But what,
the right answer out of 4.
why bother doing? If we know the evaluation thing is so flawed, what if we just said, you know what? For now, we're not going to do that. We're just not going to evaluate. We're going to have teachers and students work together. They'll have goals of some sort, but we're not going to attempt to grade them. Would that work?
It's quite possible it would if it's a community that trusts its school. I don't know how to put that, which means that it wouldn't be a school full of white teachers and black children.
Yeah. All right. And so let me ask the other obvious question, which always seems to go with this. And we had Alfie Cohen in recently. So, ask about homework as the next question, right? So if we eliminate assessment, testing and assessment,
you can have assessment that actually supports those 5 habits of mind.
Absolutely. Okay. Yes. Point taken. So how about homework? Sounds to me like it's extra work that we didn't get done in school. What do you think?
Yeah. It isn't. It's work that teachers try to invent so that they can give homework and imagine that it's easy enough so that the kids can do it when the teacher isn't there, and hard enough so that that they stick with it. And we gave homework in our schools only insofar as there were some things you had to do at home or in the library or walking through the streets of New York. So homework was not homework, it was just work that best done in a different environment than the school.
Okay.
Such as doing an interview with your family, or measuring your house, or counting the distance.
So you're no longer running one school or several schools. You're now in charge of schools for the world. I'm giving you a really interesting job. Okay. So question 1, how many kids are in each of those schools on average? Your decision completely. Whatever you
an average of about 300.
Okay. And
the number of thinking about the adults, the number of adults who can sit around one table and talk things through. The staff of the school has to be small enough so that we don't need lots of committees.
Okay.
We need a hierarchy. You just sit around.
You think 300 students did I hear you right?
Yeah.
All right. How many students per teacher?
15 to 20. 15 would be best. It's what private schools in New York will have, around 12 to 15.
It's actually the national average is like 17 in the United States. It's actually pretty close.
None of our cities.
I know.
None of the schools that serve largely low-income Black kids. I'm saying there are there's two different systems.
Okay.
Progressive suburban schools are more progressive in their viewpoint towards organizing the school in terms of these kind of assignments they give kids, how much weight they put on standardized tests. They're less likely to be tracked. And when sometimes parents would worry, are we doing the right thing? And I would arrange for them to visit some private schools to see that what we were doing is treating their kids the way we treat rich people's kids.
Okay. So let me ask you another. I'm going to go down this line of questioning a bit. So are we going to school 12 months a year? Are we going to school 10 months a year? Is there a different sort of overall?
Think about that, because that depends whether for example, having a 2-month summer vacation is I think, a wonderful idea if we have a lot of wonderful things for kids to do, or we have families who have 2 months vacation too. So it depends upon a community, has to argue that through, depending on what cost. Are they willing to pay the extra that it costs? I mean, in other words, if school is the primary purpose is to, which I think it should be, so that's the first question. The primary purpose is to pass on democracy to the next generation, to make sure that we become a democracy, more democratic.
What's the school in China if they're not a democracy?
I wouldn't give them advice, because I'd give them advice to become a democracy. That's why I'm saying there's no point in trying to mandate what they should do in China. So my mandate starts with, you gotta be a democracy.
Okay.
Now, the system won't allow you to be a democracy, then obviously they're not going to choose that.
Right.
I can't be God. I'm not allowed to be.
So let me jump to the next question.
If I could be God, by the way, I would start off with saying that China needs to be a democracy.
Okay. Thank you. How many days a week in a row should kids attend school? Number 5, or is it a different number?
It depends on what they would do when they're not in school. It depends on how you've organized the community around other things that maybe should take place. If teachers have more say about things, they also need more time to become experts and to be together. And we don't provide in this country. By the way, that's one place where most countries do give more teacher preparation time.
Okay.
And also it would help so that teachers could have families and lives, interesting lives, because if they're going to share, if kids are keeping company with a bunch of adults, I want them to be interesting adults who not just who know their subject matter, but who represent another way of thinking about what it might be like to become an adult.
Good.
And
Good.
that means I want people who've got other interests. I used to ask people when we were hiring, what are your what are you interested in? And people would assume I meant which one of the subjects. They say, I like social studies best. And the idea that a school would want to know what you have a passion for. And then I want to know what kids have a passion for.
What do you have a passion for?
Well, I think democracy has become the passion I have. And it's connected with feeling that empathy. The empathy is not something that we're born with the capacity to have empathy, but and we're born with the capacity to be equal. But we do a lot of harm when we see other people as less than.
Okay, so tell me what else you're passionate about. I understand that occupies a lot of your intellectual time.
I also happen to be passionate about swimming. And last week I had to give up swimming. I have a pond on my front yard, and a nice big pond, and I love to swim and look at the clouds. That's one of my passions. I am a passionate reader, mostly of novels. And
Have you ever seen a book called The Cloud Spotter's Guide?
no,
You should get it.
no, because it is the clouds that are so amazing. The clouds and the birds.
Yeah. So clouds, there are like 9 different kinds of clouds. And
Cirrus.
the author started out just by looking at them. And then he became curious about, well, they're different. What are they exactly, and how big? And he started researching. The most memorable story was a guy who was even more curious than he was and went to the top of a cumulonimbus cloud. And essentially, I think he parachuted his way through the cloud during a storm. And you can imagine the abuse this guy's body went through. But it was an adventure story. And you're like, I don't know if this guy is going to live. Because it was like
flying lessons. When I was 60 years old, my children, having heard me say that I always dreamed that someday I would learn to fly, they gave me flying lessons. And I learned to fly, but I did not get a solo license because I didn't think I was prepared to solo.
Right.
But and also flying wasn't. I thought flying would be like being a bird, and it turns out it isn't. A parachute may be more like it though. And when I was in Peru, I was on a thing with a big balloon on the top and a little basket down there, and flew over Lima. And when I look at the clouds, I imagine someone might be up there lying down on the cloud. That's so it's a fantasy life looking at clouds.
Okay, but let's talk about clouds. I'm interested in clouds as well. Do you think everybody's interested in clouds? I'm sorry?
No.
Okay.
Not everybody's interested in swimming too. It really annoys me. My mother was a big swimmer. I was a swimmer, and my daughter, but none of my grandchildren love swimming.
Okay.
They swim, and it's nice when they're hot,
Yep. So one of the things that I like about talking to other people, even if it's in this way and not in person, is I learn from you and you learn from me. And we build some other kind of knowledge between us, right? So maybe you'll read the book, and if you do, you'll think of me. And maybe because of some of the things we talked about, I'll think of you, which is the way it ought to be. And because everybody comes at life with different capabilities and interests and all that, we decide the best way to teach them would be to take them all, put them 30 in a room or 20 in a room and teach them the same thing. This makes absolutely no sense to me.
Doesn't match who we are.
I'm sorry?
It doesn't match who we are as learners. It's
no, from kindergarten on. So remember, in 4th grade, I was very interested in rocks. I don't think most of the kids in the class cared at all about rocks, but I was fascinated by them. So where's the path where I can learn about rocks during the school day, not to write a special report, but to pursue it? Because I don't know what it's going to turn into. But instead, I have to learn about friction. I don't really care about friction. I have to learn about. So at what point do I get the freedom as a student to be guided, but not told what to learn? Or is that too radical?
Well, there can be, a compromise with which all of life is a compromise, but it can be a compromise. You can have themes in which kids can study the things within that theme that they like, which might include rocks. You can have a period of each school year where they can choose anything they want. You can have a period of the day where you have independent choice time. So there's a combination, but there also, I think, a responsibility to some degree of we as adults thinking about things that will open up a whole series of aspects of the world that children might not have known about. And friction is one of those.
Oh, okay, fair enough.
Gravity and friction and so forth. There's So we spent in our physics curriculum at the secondary school, kids spend a whole year in the physics part, doing what most kids do in one semester, so that kids can really begin to explore things in physics that strike them as interesting. And actually, it turns out it's a wonderful subject. It's the one I didn't take in high school, but it turns out physics is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many different aspects of physics and different approaches to it.
Well,
I found out about that because I took a course in Colorado with a fascinating scientist who did a course for teachers over the summer in which they studied gravity. And I had no idea what gravity really was as a fascinating idea. And when I left that after 5 weeks, I spent the drive back east trying to, hold on to what I'd learned. By the time I got home, I had it, it needs to be, that's why it needs less is more. You need have a chance to keep playing with things. You can't just learn them and move on to something else. I learned that. So it's the playing with it.
I agree with you. But the curriculum takes me from one amusement ride to another without really connecting them, right? So I wrote a book with two friends about time travel, and the basis of it was theoretical physics. And then we started figuring out.
Is that your field? Is that your field?
I can't hear you.
Is that your field?
No, not. We would. My friend was one of the kids in Chicago. There was a science, like a Mr. Wizard type on local television in Chicago. You may even know the name, but I don't remember. And she was one of the science kids who were on the show. She was it was and it remains a very smart person who was very curious about science. So we were in a Japanese restaurant, and just because we were talking, she's like, "Well, let me explain to you how time travel would be possible." And she explains the physics of time travel. And she's doing it on a napkin. And I look at her and I go, "You know what? This would be a really cool book. We should write a book together that would be like a tourist's guide to the fourth dimension," which ended up being the subtitle. She's like, "Well, yeah, but wouldn't we want to have illustrations?" So we brought a friend who was a puppeteer and animator in, and the three of us made a book. And we learned an enormous amount about history, the history of Roman plumbing. It just opened up all these doors, right? So it was great to be able to experience that. Now, if that were a school project, we definitely would have studied something completely different the next week. Now,
well, not if you'd gone to any of the schools I was in.
All right, but unfortunately, those schools have been shut. I mean, we have the big bad guy who's going to be like, "We're not going to permit that to continue."
Well, we don't. We do for some kids.
We do.
I think private schools probably. Well, of course, most of the private schools in New York City, aside from Catholic schools, are progressive schools. Virtually all of them.
Yeah, but that's not going to solve the problem, is it?
Yeah, so they only teach some kids.
And those kids are the kids with money. Yeah. So now we exacerbate, right? I mean, it sort of leads us on a path that we began.
I'm just saying, that works. We know those kids do. Why do we deprive poor kids of what? It's bad enough that they have 4 times as much money to spend.
So the more I learn about school, the more I'm convinced you're right, but I'm not convinced that we can't or won't do this for everybody. It just seems like too good an idea to be able to, we can't, somehow we've got to get past the forces that are stopping us, stopping you, stopping others who believe the way you believe from making progress. I mean, it just seems it's so obvious to me what we need to do. And I'm no genius at this. I've only been doing this for a few years, but it resonates.
I don't know what they, I think like you, that it's such an obvious idea and it's so well documented. And we have plenty of data to prove that I'm right and that you're right. and that it's clearly something that has nothing to do with education that's stopping us. I remember the chancellor who decided we couldn't accept the Annenberg money said, I didn't come to New York City to have a system that I had no power over.
Okay.
So I think it has something to do with power and status.
A lot to do with power.
And the caste system, you want to be at the top, not the bottom. And
But we've got 50.
once you have power, you want to hold on to it.
But we have 50 million kids and 4 million teachers just in public school, maybe more than that in the United States.
They don't make the decisions about what.
How do we move those people over to a position where they do?
Yeah, well, I thought I knew and I was wrong. So I don't know. I thought if we could prove that it's doable on a large enough scale for precisely for the kids who people would say it doesn't work for. And if we wrote about it and made movies about it and did all that, first of all, we'd convince teachers and parents who would start demanding it. And that was true. But the power is not equal.
Okay, but we have the internet now.
People on my side have other agendas, like the union. I mean, they were supporters and they remained supporters of us. But it wasn't their number. They weren't going to go to strong strike.
So I often tell this story. There was a time when girls had to wear dresses in my high school. And then one day they said, we're not doing that anymore. And they stopped. And from that moment on, girls didn't have to wear dresses. To me, that was one of the clearest expressions of student power. If you have a school filled with kids who simply aren't going to go in the direction you want them to go, you can them.
And that happened to me too. You're younger than me. And we didn't win. And this was in a private school. I think our parents didn't support it either. Yes, I wanted to be able to wear pants at least in the winter. And we did win that. If the temperature was below something, we were allowed to wear pants.
Okay, but the allowed part, that the part where anybody is making the decision for you is deeply concerning.
Mm-hmm.
So we're at a point where we've given students the opportunity to choose identity, the opportunity to choose their friends, to make decisions that never would have been permitted or even considered years ago. But now they are. And they have a means to communicate with one another, not only locally, but around the world. So there's much more power because they're connected than there's ever been before. There's also much more distraction because adults, if they're paying any attention at all, they should be thinking about the economy, climate change, or the pandemic. That should keep them busy. I love brush fires in that way. I love the idea of keeping people who are trying to make decisions that don't help, non-helpful decisions. I love keeping them busy with a distraction. And then we go do whatever we have to do. I don't think any television series.
I like that idea. But in some ways, we thought we were doing that. We weren't requiring any school to do what we did. We were just saying that people who want to do what we do should have a right to do it. And it was getting bigger every year.
Yeah, right.
And then we get this money to make it even bigger from a very powerful person.
Yeah.
And you're right. It was stunning. The only thing I must say that kept me alive after that, in a way, is that they couldn't take away what we did with those children. You know, I'm still in touch. In fact, we're trying to make a movie about the earliest graduates who are now in their 40s. And, you know, that one advantage of being a teacher is the people that you've influenced and who've influenced you, that's forever.
Oh.
And,
yeah.
You know, when I the last thing in the world, I was a graduate, got a graduate degree from the University of Chicago. And I started teaching subbing for my young children. And I just thought it would be a nice thing to do 2 days a week. And And then they offered me a job as a kindergarten teacher at the school my children were going to, and I thought, that's only mornings, that would be good, I'll have the afternoons free. And I fell in love with kindergarten kids for just the reason you're talking about. I found them fascinating, that's all. Their interests were fascinating, their theories about life were fascinating. They opened up the world for me. It's the way why adults, go to zoos, prefer to go to zoos with their children, because their children are genuinely interested in what those animals are doing, and most adults aren't, but you become interested. And I found it was the most intellectually exciting experience. All the good schools I went to and all the fine professors I had, I found those kids intellectually more exciting.
Yeah, that's a great note to stop on. What we're going to do is going to roll the credits, and then if you can hang on for a second right afterwards, we'll just chat for a minute. Okay. So thanks, everybody. And this conversation continues. We're doing a lot of things about social action in the month of November. So the next few episodes are going to be weaving in and out of that and positive education. So
one thing you might weave in and out of that is the power of small schools. I do think that small schools make democracy more manageable. And more obvious that it's unfair because you know each other.
Yeah, maybe small countries too.
Yes.
On that, thank you. We'll roll the credits. For on-demand episodes and more, visit our website. Kids on Earth contains hundreds of video interviews with students from around the world. Learning Revolution is a global collaboration network for people who care about learning. Be sure to join us next Thursday for a new episode of Reinventing School. Thanks for watching.